The winter of 1878 clawed at the Bitterroot Valley, a starvation winter that drove the wolves down from the high passes and men to acts of quiet desperation. The snow had come early and stayed late, a thick, suffocating blanket that promised no spring. The deer were gone, their tracks long since buried. Even the rabbits, usually a plague of gray fur, seemed to have vanished into the frozen earth. In the small, struggling settlement huddled near the base of the mountains, hunger was a physical presence. It hollowed the cheeks of the children and put a dull, glassy look in the eyes of the women. For Clara, the cold was inside and out. It had been that way for 3 months, ever since her mother had succumbed to the lung fever, leaving her alone with Silas. Silas, her stepfather, was a man whose kindness, thin as it was, had been buried with his wife. He looked at Clara and saw only a burden, another mouth to consume the dwindling supply of cornmeal. He was a cruel man, but his cruelty was pragmatic, rooted in a desperate kind of survival. Clara was 17, old enough to be useful, but Silas had no use for her that did not curdle his stomach with guilt, a guilt he quickly turned to anger. She was her mother's daughter, and her mother was gone. She was dead weight. The morning he told her to get her coat, the thin wool one that did nothing against the wind. She knew. She did not ask where they were going. She did not plead or cry. She had learned, over years of his heavy hand and short temper, that silence was her only armor. To fight was to invite more pain. She had used up all her fight years ago. Defending her mother, there was nothing left to defend. She followed him the 2 miles to McTavish's trading post, the snow crunching under her worn boots. The air was so cold it felt like breathing in splinters of glass. She kept her eyes on Silas's back, watching the way his shoulders hunched against the wind. A figure of grim purpose. She felt a dreadful numbness, a resignation that was almost a relief. Whatever was coming, it was simply the next thing. The post was thick with the smell of damp wool, curing tobacco, and the sour odor of unwashed men. It was crowded, a refuge of grim faces swapping rumors of failed traps and thin game. Silas shoved her toward the back, near the massive stone fireplace where a man sat cleaning a rifle, his face a landscape of dirt and old scars. Silas found his man near the counter, Jebediah Stone. Jeb was a trapper, older than Silas, with a greasy beard and small, acquisitive eyes that seemed to be constantly counting. He smelled of tallow and old blood. "She's thin," Jeb said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't look at Silas. He looked at Clara, his gaze moving over her body like a hand, assessing livestock. "It's the famine," Silas said, trying for a jovial tone that cracked. "Good stock, strong, hard worker." "All mouths are hard workers this winter," Jeb muttered. He reached out and grabbed Clara's chin, forcing her face into the light. She flinched, but did not pull away. His thumb scraped over the yellowing bruise on her jaw, a parting gift from Silas 2 nights prior. "And someone's already worked her over. She's clumsy," Silas lied, his voice going hard. Clara stood frozen, her gaze fixed on a crack in the floorboards. She felt the heavy, assessing stare of every man in the room. She was a spectacle, a piece of meat on the block. She felt a quiet, distant horror, like watching herself drown from a great height. Jeb let her go, wiping his hand on his fur breeches. He turned to Silas. "I ain't got much to spare." 2 barrels, Silas said, the words rushing out. "Just 2 barrels of flour. That's all I'm asking." A silence fell. 2 barrels was a fortune. It was also, Clara knew, the price of a good horse. Jeb grunted, looking from the girl to the desperation in Silas's eyes. He had the power here. He chewed on a piece of tobacco, then spat a brown stream onto the floor. 1 barrel, and the sack of salt pork I got cached outside. 2, Silas insisted, but his voice wavered. 1, Jeb repeated. He turned his back, pretending to inspect a row of traps. Silas's shoulders slumped. He had lost. He was about to agree, to trade her life for a single barrel of flour, when another voice cut through the thick air. It was a low voice, rough with disuse, like stones grinding together. 4 barrels. Every head in the trading post turned. The man who had been sitting by the fire was standing now. He was tall, broader than Silas and Jeb combined, and dressed head to toe in smoked hides and furs that made him look more like a part of the mountain than a man. He moved with a quiet, lethal grace, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He wasn't looking at Silas or Jeb. He was looking at Clara. He was, she thought, the roughest man she had ever seen. His beard was untamed, his black hair long and tied back with a leather thong. A brutal scar, silvery and old, ran from his jawline up toward his ear, disappearing into his hair. But his eyes were clear and gray as the winter sky, and they held an intensity that made her breath catch. He saw her, he saw the bruises, and he saw the numbness beneath them. Jeb Stone turned, his hand instinctively moving to the knife on his belt. "This ain't your affair, mountain man." The tall man ignored him. He looked at McTavish, the post owner, who stood wide-eyed behind the counter. 4 barrels of your best flour, on my credit." McTavish swallowed. "Elias, that's a heavy price. For 4 barrels," Elias repeated. He hadn't raised his voice, but the command in it was absolute. McTavish nodded quickly, already moving to the ledger. Silas stared, his mouth open. 4 barrels. He had been cheated. Jeb Stone stepped forward, his face darkening with rage. "I made a deal. She's mine." Elias finally turned his gaze to the trapper. He didn't raise his rifle. He didn't tense. He simply looked at him. And in that look was a cold, quiet promise of violence that dwarfed Jeb's bluster. "The deal wasn't finished," Elias said. "I'm finishing it. She goes with me." Jeb's hand tightened on his knife. The room was silent save for the crackle of the fire. The trapper was known for his temper. A vicious man in a fight. But Elias was an unknown quantity. He was a creature of the high peaks, a man who survived winters that killed other men. Jeb looked at the mountain man's sheer size, the casual way he held the rifle, and the dead certainty in his gray eyes. Then he looked at the 4 barrels of flour McTavish was already having rolled out. Pride warred with profit. Profit won. Jeb sneered, spitting on the floor again. "Fine. She ain't worth that much trouble. Hope she's worth the price. Mountain man. She's probably barren anyway." Elias didn't respond. He jerked his chin toward the door. "Get the flour on my wagon." Then he looked at Clara. For the first time in her life, she felt truly, profoundly terrified. She had been sold, not just sold, but bought, for a price that shocked the entire settlement. She had gone from one kind of monster to another. This new one, this silent giant, was surely more dangerous than Silas or Jeb. He lived alone in the wilderness. She knew what men like that wanted. "Come," he said. It was not a request. Clara, wrapped in her numbness, turned and walked out of the trading post. She did not look back at Silas. She felt the cold air hit her face and did not shiver. His wagon was old but sturdy, pulled by 2 massive mules that snorted steam in the cold. It was loaded with bundled pelts, wolf, fox, and beaver. So many they overflowed the sides. He gestured to the seat. She climbed up, her legs stiff, and sat on the hard wood. He didn't speak. He oversaw the loading of the flour, tied it down with practiced, efficient motions, and then climbed up beside her. He was so close she could smell him. He smelled of pine, wood smoke, and cold iron. He snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. Clara watched the trading post disappear. She watched the last cabin of the settlement fall behind them. She had just been traded for 2 barrels of flour, and a mountain man had paid 4. She feared she had just become the most expensive slave in the territory. They traveled for hours, leaving the valley floor and climbing into the teeth of the mountains. The landscape grew harsher, more brutal. With every mile, the trail became a narrow ledge cut into the rock, the world falling away into a white, forested canyon on one side. The trees were skeletal, their branches coated in thick, glittering ice. The peaks above them were silent, jagged, and indifferent. Elias handled the mules with a sure, steady hand. He seemed untroubled by the dangerous terrain. As at home here as she had been in her mother's kitchen, the sun was a cold, white coin, beginning its descent. When they finally arrived, his cabin wasn't a shack. It was built. It was made of thick, dark logs, set deep into the side of a mountain, sheltered by a ring of ancient pines. It looked like it had grown from the rock, solid and permanent. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, meaning he had banked his fire before he left. He pulled the wagon to a halt, jumped down, and began unhitching the mules without a word. Clara sat frozen, her hands numb, her body aching with a bone-deep chill. She didn't know what to do. Was she waiting? To follow? He finished with the mules, leading them to a small, sturdy lean-to. Then he came back to the wagon and looked up at her. "Get down!" She slid off the seat, her legs buckling slightly when she hit the snow. He didn't offer a hand. He just watched her, his face impassive in the growing twilight. He pushed open the heavy cabin door and went inside. After a moment's hesitation, she followed him into the warm darkness. He lit a kerosene lamp, and the room flickered to life. It was a single, large space, dominated by a huge stone fireplace where embers glowed. It was meticulously clean. Tools hung in neat rows on one wall. Pelts were stacked tidily in a corner. On the other side of the room was a simple bed, a wooden frame covered in a mountain of thick furs. He gestured to it. "You sleep there." Clara stared at him, confused. Elias moved to the fireplace. He stirred the embers, added 3 large logs, and the fire began to blaze. Then he unrolled his own bedroll, a thick canvas and fur contraption, and laid it on the hearth, on the hard stone floor. He took off his heavy outer coat, hanging it by the door. He turned his back to her. "There's stew in the pot by the fire. Eat if you're hungry." He sat on his bedroll, his back to her, and began to pull off his boots. He did not look at her again. He had given her the only bed. Clara stood by the door, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard it hurt. She was tense, watchful, every nerve screaming. This was a trick. This was a test. No man gave up his bed. She did not move for nearly an hour. She listened to the sound of his breathing, the crackle of the fire, the rising moan of the wind outside. Her body was rigid with pain, the bruises from Silas throbbing in the sudden warmth. She was exhausted, but sleep was impossible. She was confused. She was deeply suspicious. She wondered if he was simply waiting until she was less bruised, less frozen. Or perhaps he was waiting for her to show gratitude, to come to him, so he could claim she had offered. Finally, the shivering became too much, moving slowly, so as not to startle him. She crept to the bed. She did not take off her coat or her boots. She lay on top of the furs, her body coiled tight, facing the door, facing him. She watched his back, a solid, unmoving wall in the firelight. He didn't speak. He didn't move. After a long time, his breathing deepened into the slow, even rhythm of sleep. Clara did not sleep. She watched the fire dance, listening to the wind howl, and waited for the monster to show his true face. He was awake before the sun, moving with that same unnatural quiet. He stoked the fire, put on his boots, and slipped out the door into the pre-dawn gray, his rifle in hand. Clara had only just drifted into a fitful, shallow sleep. The sound of the latch clicking shut snapped her awake. She sat bolt upright, terrified. He was gone. Had he locked her in? She scrambled off the bed, her stockinged feet hitting the cold floor. She had kicked off her boots in her sleep and ran to the door. It opened easily. The cold hit her like a slap. Outside, the world was a sea of gray and white. Elias was nowhere to be seen. She retreated, shutting the door, her confusion mounting. He had left her alone, unlocked. He returned an hour later, a brace of rabbits hanging from his belt. He didn't seem surprised to see her awake. He just nodded, hung the rabbits outside, and came in to shrug off his coat. He moved to the fire and began preparing food. heating the stew from last night, adding water to it from a bucket by the door. He didn't speak much. In fact, he didn't speak at all unless necessary. He ate his own portion of the stew standing by the fire, then put on his coat and went back outside. She spent the day watching him through the cabin's single, small window. He was never still. He cut wood, splitting massive rounds with an ease that spoke of incredible strength. He repaired a harness. He cleared snow from the mule's lean-to. He kept busy, and he left her utterly alone. He left her room to breathe, and the silence was more unnerving than any threat. She found herself watching him. He was, she had to admit, strong. He moved with an economy of motion, no wasted energy. He was also, she noticed, strangely gentle with the animals. The mules, which had seemed half wild, nudged his pockets for treats, and he rubbed their ears with a rough tenderness. A half-wild cat, gray and thin, emerged from the woodshed and rubbed against his legs, and he scratched its chin before tossing it a scrap of meat. This was the most confusing thing of all. The gentleness. It did not fit the scar on his jaw, or the coldness in his eyes at the trading post. The day passed. Night fell. The ritual repeated. He pointed her to the bed. He took the floor by the fire. He turned his back. On the third morning, the wind changed. It stopped being a wind and became a presence. A high, thin scream that seemed to come from inside the earth. The sky, which had been clear, turned a bruised, sickly yellow. Elias came inside, his arms full of firewood. He dropped it by the hearth, snow dusting his shoulders. "It's here," he said. "What is?" Clara asked, her first words to him since the wagon. "The blizzard. We'll be inside for days." He wasn't wrong. Within an hour, the world dissolved. The snow didn't fall. It moved horizontally. A white wall that erased the trees, the mountains, the sky. The wind hammered the cabin, shrieking like a banshee trying to claw its way in. They were trapped. The small cabin, which he had made feel large, suddenly became tiny, claustrophobic. They were forced into constant proximity. For 3 days, the storm raged. They lived by firelight, the single window a sheet of white. They moved around each other, a silent, tense dance. He carved wood. She watched the fire, the trauma, held at bay by numbness and confusion, finally found its way to the surface. The sound of the wind was too much like screaming. On the second night of the blizzard, she woke up choking, clawing at the furs. A scream locked in her throat. Silas's face was hovering in the darkness, his hand raised. She must have made a sound, a whimper, across the cabin. Elias sat up, in the dim, glowing light of the embers. She saw him. He didn't speak. He didn't rush to her. He simply reached for a log, placed it carefully on the fire, and used the poker to stir the embers. Sparks flew up, and the new log caught. Flaring, pushing the shadows back, he sat on his bedroll, watching the flames. "Not her. You are safe here," he said, his voice low. He didn't ask what she dreamt. He didn't ask who she was screaming for. He didn't try to touch her. Clara's breathing was ragged. She pulled the furs up to her chin, her body trembling. He sat by the fire for another hour, a silent guardian, until her breathing evened out. The storm lasted 2 more days. She had the nightmare again, and again. Elias woke. He did not ask questions. He did not offer empty comforts. He simply fed the fire, a practical, solid presence that anchored her to the small, warm cabin, a bulwark against the screaming wind and the ghosts of her past. He just sat watch, letting the light chase the darkness away. The blizzard finally broke on the 4th morning, leaving the world transformed into a blinding expanse of white. The sun returned, sharp and brilliant, reflecting off the snow with a glare that made the eyes ache. With the storms passing, the crushing tension inside the cabin began to recede, replaced by a quiet, tentative rhythm. Clara had expected demands. She had expected the debt of 4 barrels of flour to be collected in flesh and obedience, but the demand never came. Elias moved through the small space they shared with a respectful distance that was almost architectural in its precision. When it was time for her to wash or change her clothes, He did not just turn his head. He put on his coat and went outside to chop wood or check the mules, staying away long enough to ensure she had absolute privacy. He knocked on his own door before re-entering. It was a small thing, this knocking, but to Clara, it was a revelation. It was a boundary he refused to cross, a silent declaration that her body was her own, regardless of the transaction at the trading post. Slowly, the knot of terror in her chest began to loosen. The constant, vibrating adrenaline that had kept her awake for the first week faded into a watchful wariness, and then, gradually, into a kind of peaceful curiosity. One afternoon, Elias took the mules down toward the creek to break the ice for them to drink. Clara found herself alone in the cabin with time to look, really look, at the cage she had been put in. It was a masculine space, utilitarian and sparse, but as she moved through it, she began to see the details that betrayed the man who lived there. The cabin was not just built, it was crafted. The table she ate at was not merely planks nailed together. The edges were sanded smooth as river stones, the joints fitted with a joiner's precision, no nails visible. The wooden bowls were hand-carved from burl wood, their grains swirling like trapped smoke. She ran her hand along the mantel of the fireplace. It was a single beam of dark oak, and carved into the corner was a tiny, intricate owl, no bigger than her thumb. Its feathers were etched with painstaking care. It was a useless, beautiful thing. On a high shelf near the window, she found a stack of leather-bound bundles. Curiosity, a feeling she hadn't felt in years, prickled at her. She reached up and took down the top one. It was a journal, the leather cover stained with grease and age. She opened it, expecting to find tallies of pelts or lists of supplies. Instead, she found handwriting. It was cramped and jagged, written with a heavy hand, but the lines were arranged in stanzas. The mountain holds the silence close, like a breath held in the dark. The wind remembers what we lost and carves it in the bark. Clara stared at the words. Poetry. The scarred, silent giant who could break a man's arm as easily as a dry twig wrote poetry about the wind. She turned the pages. There were drawings, too, sketches of birds, the curve of a wolf's jaw, the delicate structure of a wildflower, and there were darker entries, lines about fire and iron, about screams that didn't fade when the sun came up. She closed the book quickly as she heard the heavy crunch of boots on snow outside, placing it back exactly where she found it. Her heart beat fast, not with fear, but with the shock of discovery. He was not a monster. He was a man who saw the world with a terrifying amount of depth. The following week, the lessons began. The snow was deep, but the work of survival did not stop. Elias did not leave her behind in the cabin to tend the fire. He tossed her a pair of snowshoes he had fashioned from ash wood and rawhide. "Put them on," he said. "We need meat." He did not slow his pace for her as they trudged into the timber, forcing her to find her own rhythm. When they reached his trap line, he didn't just clear the snares himself. He knelt in the snow and showed her the mechanism. "A rabbit is quick," he said, his voice rumbling in the cold air. "But it is a creature of habit. It runs the same path. You don't hunt the animal, you hunt the habit." He made her set the snare. Her fingers were clumsy with cold, and she fumbled the wire. She waited for the reprimand, for the sigh of impatience Silas would have given, the shove aside. Elias just watched. He waited. He let her fail, reset, and fail again. When she finally set the trigger correctly, he gave a single, sharp nod. "Good." He taught her to read the snow. He showed her how the depression in a drift meant a deer had bedded down, how the scratch marks on a pine trunk signaled a bear's territory, though the bears were sleeping now. He handed her the axe one afternoon and pointed to the wood pile. "The grain has a direction," he told her. "Fight it, and the axe bounces. Read it, and the wood splits itself." He didn't take the axe from her when she struggled. He let her sweat, let her arms ache, until she found the sweet spot where the steel bit deep and the log cracked open with a satisfying pop. He assumed she could do it. He never treated her as if she were weak or foolish or merely a woman to be sheltered. He treated her like a partner who needed to pull her weight. It was exhausting, brutal work, but for the first time in her life, Clara felt a strange sense of power. She was useful. Not useful like a tool to be used by others, but capable. Yet the past was not so easily outrun. It happened on a Tuesday, a day that dawned gray and heavy. They were down by the river, chopping through the ice to fill the water buckets. The wind was biting, whipping Clara's hair across her face. She was tired, her muscles aching from the wood splitting the day before. She dipped the bucket into the dark, swirling water, and hauled it up. The weight of it threw her off balance. Her boot slipped on the ice. She fell hard, the bucket overturning, soaking her skirt and coat with freezing water. The shock of the cold was instant, but it wasn't the cold that broke her. It was the sudden, crushing weight of everything. The years of walking on eggshells around Silas, the trading post, the fear, the exhaustion, the sheer, impossible vastness of the wilderness around her. She didn't try to get up. She just sat there on the ice, wet and shivering, and began to weep. It wasn't a soft crying. It was a heaving, ugly sobbing that tore at her throat. She covered her face with her freezing hands, unable to stop. She heard Elias's boots crunching toward her. She flinched, expecting anger. He would be mad if she was wet. He would be mad she had spilled the water. He would be mad if she was weak. The footsteps stopped. She felt a heavy warmth settle over her shoulders. Clara lowered her hands. Elias was kneeling in the snow beside her. He had taken off his heavy buffalo hide coat and draped it over her, leaving himself in just his wool shirt against the biting wind. He didn't say a word. He didn't tell her to hush. He didn't tell her to get up. He just stayed there, a solid wall against the wind, waiting. She looked at him, her eyes blurred with tears. He was looking at the river, his expression distant, and in that moment, the mask of the stoic mountain man slipped. She saw the weariness in the lines of his face. She saw a deep, ancient sadness in the gray of his eyes that mirrored her own. He wasn't looking at the water. He was looking at something far away and long gone. He wasn't just tolerating her grief. He was understanding it. "I'm sorry," she choked out, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said softly. "The mountains take a toll. Sometimes you have to pay for it in tears." He stood up then, offering her a hand. It was rough and calloused, the size of a shovel blade. She took it. He pulled her up effortlessly. "Let's get you dry," he said. He picked up the empty bucket and walked back toward the cabin, not waiting for her, but walking slow enough that she could keep pace in his footprints. That evening, the silence in the cabin changed. It was no longer a wall between them. It was a bridge. They ate near the fire, the wind rattling the door latch. Elias had dried his coat, and Clara was wearing one of his spare flannel shirts while her dress dried. It swallowed her frame, but it was warm. "You write poetry," she said. It wasn't a question. Elias paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. He looked at her, surprised. He didn't deny it. Paper is quieter than people. It listens better. "I read one," she confessed, bracing for his anger at her intrusion. He took a slow breath, staring into the fire. "Which one?" "The one about the wind, remembering?" He nodded slowly. "That was from the war." He set his bowl down. He looked at his hands, flexing his fingers. "I was a scout for the Union, Army of the Cumberland. My job was to watch, to listen, to be a ghost." Clara waited. He had never spoken of this. "I got caught," he said, the words coming out flat and hard. "Near Chickamauga. They thought I was a spy. They wanted to know where the main force was moving." He touched the scar on his jaw lightly. "They asked me for 3 days. I didn't tell them." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty cabin. Is that where you got the scar?" "This?" He traced the line. "No, this was later. After the war, I came home. I had a wife, Sarah." It was the first time he had said a woman's name. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. She was light, like you." He looked at Clara then, his eyes unguarded. "A raiding party came while I was checking the lines. Renegades, not soldiers, just men who like to break things." He fell silent for a long time. I buried her under a birch tree. I came out here because I couldn't stand the noise of the world anymore. I couldn't stand the people in it. Clara looked at him, seeing the jagged pieces of his soul that he had glued back together with silence and solitude. My mother died 3 months ago, Clara said. Her voice was steady, stating facts. She had lung fever. She coughed until she couldn't breathe. Elias watched her, listening with the intensity of a predator or a protector. My stepfather, Silas, he blamed me for being alive when she wasn't. He was a small man. Small men like to make others feel smaller. She looked at her hands, remembering the rough grip of Silas's fingers, the back of his hand. He hit me because the stew was cold. He hit me because it snowed. He hit me because I looked like her. She looked up, meeting Elias's gaze. He didn't trade me because we were starving. We had corn. He traded me because he wanted the flour, and he wanted to be rid of the reminder. I was a bargaining chip. 2 barrels. That's what he thought I was worth. She didn't cry. She had cried by the river. This was different. This was witnessed. Elias looked at her for a long, long time. The firelight danced in his eyes. He was a fool, Elias rumbled, and a coward. It was the most he had said in weeks. It was enough. The days began to lengthen as the heart of winter passed. The mornings were still brutal, but the light lingered longer in the evenings. One morning, Clara was helping with breakfast. The cabin was small, and they moved around each other with a practiced dance. She reached for the coffee pot at the same moment Elias reached for the skillet. Their hands brushed. It wasn't the first time they had touched. He had helped her up from the snow, handed her tools, but this was different. It was skin on skin, warm and sudden. Clara didn't pull back immediately. Her fingers grazed the back of his hand, tracing the rough knuckles, the white ridges of old scars. Elias froze. He went perfectly still, his breath catching in his chest. He looked down at their hands, then up at her face. His eyes were wide, startled, like a deer scenting man. The touch lingered for a heartbeat. 2, 3. The air between them crackled with a sudden, sharp electricity. It wasn't fear. It was awareness. He was a man. She was a woman. And they were alone in a world of white. Elias pulled his hand back first, his movement jerky. He turned away to the fire, clearing his throat. "Coffee's ready," he muttered. But the shift had happened. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a thick, heavy tension that followed them through the day. Every glance felt weighted. Every silence felt loaded. That night, the wind was howling again, a reminder that winter was not done with them. The fire was roaring. Elias sat in his usual chair, a block of pine in his hands, his knife shaving off curls of wood. He was carving another owl. Clara sat on the rug near the hearth, mending a tear in her skirt. She found herself inching closer to him, drawn to his warmth, drawn to the steady, hypnotic movement of his hands. She stopped sewing and watched him. The knife moved with such precision. He was a man of violence who created gentle things. She scooted closer until her shoulder was almost touching his knee. She could feel the heat radiating from him. Elias stopped carving. He didn't look at her. He held the knife still, his knuckles white on the handle. The silence stretched, tight as a bowstring. Slowly, he turned his head. He looked down at her. His face was shadowed, but his eyes were burning. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he brushed a stray lock of hair back from her forehead. His fingers were rough, but his touch was terrifyingly gentle. His thumb grazed her cheekbone. "You shouldn't be this close," he said, his voice a rough whisper. Clara didn't flinch. She leaned into his hand, just a fraction. "Why?" "Because I am not a safe man. Clara, you're the only safe thing I've ever known," she said. His hand trembled slightly against her cheek. He looked at her mouth, then back to her eyes. A war being fought behind his gaze. "I don't belong to anyone," Clara said softly. "Silas didn't own me. The trapper didn't buy me. And you didn't buy me either." Elias's expression softened, a crack in the stone. "No," he said. I never thought you did. I never wanted to own you. I just wanted you out of that room. I know, she whispered. She rose onto her knees. She was eye level with him now as he sat in the chair. She moved slowly, giving him every chance to push her away, to stand up, to leave. He didn't move. He watched her, his breathing shallow. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. It was a soft kiss, unsure, a question asked in the dark. Her lips were dry, and his beard was rough against her skin. It tasted like coffee and wood smoke. For a moment, he remained rigid, a statue. Then, with a low groan in his throat, he dropped the knife. His hands came up to cup her face, holding her like she was made of glass. He kissed her back, a tentative pressure that hinted at a vast, restrained hunger. Then, just as quickly, he pulled away. He stood up, putting distance between them. He walked to the window and stared out at the black night, his back to her. His chest was heaving. "You don't owe me this," he said, his voice harsh. "You don't pay for your life with your body, not with me. I won't be that man." Clara remained kneeling by the fire. She felt a flush of heat, but no shame. She understood him. He was terrified that she was kissing him out of gratitude, out of obligation, out of the same survival instinct that had kept her alive with Silas. "I know," she said, her voice clear and strong in the quiet room. "I know I don't owe you anything. That's why I want to—" Elias turned back to her. He looked at her, really looked at her, searching for the lie, searching for the fear. He found neither. He found a woman who was making a choice. He let out a long, shuddering breath. The tension didn't leave his shoulders, but the wall didn't go back up. "Go to sleep, Clara," he said gently. She stood up. She walked to the bed, but she didn't get under the furs alone. She stopped and looked at him. "The floor is cold," she said. Elias hesitated. Then he walked to the fire and kicked dirt over the embers, dimming the light. He walked to the bed. He did not touch her. He lay down on top of the furs, on the far edge of the mattress, fully clothed. Clara lay down beside him, under the furs. There was a foot of distance between them, but in the darkness, she could hear his heart beating. It was a fast, steady rhythm. Sometime in the night, as the cold crept into the cabin, she shifted. She moved across the empty space until her back was pressed against his side. He stiffened. Then slowly, he relaxed. He didn't put his arm around her. He didn't move to take more. He simply let her borrow his warmth, for the first time in her life. Clara fell asleep without fear, anchored by the heavy, solid presence of the man who had traded 4 barrels of flour for her freedom, and had asked for nothing in return. The snow did not vanish, but retreated. It surrendered the land inch by grudging inch, melting away from the south-facing slopes first, revealing the matted brown earth beneath. The world, which had been silent and white, was now filled with the sound of dripping water, the rush of swollen creeks, and the sudden, clear call of a returning robin. The air, once sharp as glass, became soft, carrying the smell of damp soil and budding pine. With the spring, Clara bloomed. The gaunt, hollow-eyed girl who had stumbled into the cabin was gone. The bruises had faded, leaving no trace. But the transformation was deeper than skin. The hard, daily labor of survival had layered muscle onto her thin frame. The steady, plentiful food, venison, rabbit stew, and the last of the winter's root vegetables, had put color in her cheeks and a bright sheen in her hair. She moved with a purpose, her shoulders back, her gaze steady. She was no longer a shadow. She was a presence. She worked the land with Elias. They were a team, their movements falling into a rhythm that required few words. Together, they cleared a small patch of land near the creek for a garden, turning over the rich, dark soil that had hidden under the snow. She learned to mend his tools, to read the weather in the clouds, to walk the trap lines alone. He had taught her to be self-sufficient, and in doing so, had bound her closer to him than any chain could. Their intimacy deepened, measured not in grand gestures, but in the small, shared moments of their life. It was in the way she handed him his coffee in the morning, her fingers brushing his, and neither of them pulling away. It was in the shared glance and the ghost of a smile when one of the mules was particularly stubborn. It was in the evenings, when she would read from his poetry journal aloud, her voice filling the cabin, and he would sit carving, his head bowed, listening. The tension that had begun with a kiss did not fade. It settled between them, a low, thrumming hum beneath the surface of their daily lives. The bed was their unspoken battlefield. They still slept together, but he was a fortress of restraint. He would lie on his back, stiff as a plank, his hands folded on his chest, while she lay beside him, acutely aware of the warmth radiating from his body, the scent of him, the sheer size and power held in rigid check. Some nights she would wake from a dream and find him watching her, his face a mask of conflict in the moonlight, his eyes burning with a hunger he refused to acknowledge. He would see her wake, and he would turn away, rising from the bed to add wood to the fire, breaking the spell. Clara, now strong in her body and healing in her mind, could not understand the wall. He had saved her. He had taught her. He treated her as an equal, but he would not touch her. The rejection was a confusing, dull ache. One evening, after a long day of clearing rocks from the garden plot, she was washing her face in the basin. He was standing near the door, watching the sunset paint the peaks purple. She had touched his shoulder as she passed, a casual, affectionate gesture. He had flinched, not violently, but a sudden, sharp intake of breath, a tensing of muscle, and had stepped away. The small rejection was the final straw. She turned from the basin, water dripping from her chin. "Why do you do that?" Elias turned from the door, his face in shadow. "Do what? Why do you pull away from me?" Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the cabin. "Why do you look at me like you're starving, but you refuse to eat? Am I still just a debt to you? Something you bought but decided you didn't want?" The words hit him harder than a physical blow. He visibly recoiled, his face pale. "Clara, never, don't ever say that." "Then why?" she demanded, stepping closer. She was not the cowed girl from the trading post. She was a woman demanding an answer. "You sleep beside me every night like you're guarding a chest of gold you're terrified to open. You look at me, but you won't touch me. Am I unclean? Am I not? Am I not what you wanted when you paid for the flower?" "Stop," he said, his voice a low growl. He looked cornered, trapped. "No," she said, her hands clenching at her sides. "I won't stop. I deserve to know." He slammed his fist against the log wall, a crack of sound that made her jump. He didn't turn on her. He leaned his forehead against the logs, his eyes squeezed shut. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice ragged. "I've seen what men do. I've seen it in the war, and I've seen it out here. Men who see a woman as a thing, a piece of property to be used, to be broken, and to be thrown away." He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a self-loathing that stunned her into silence. "I have killed men for that. I have put bullets in men who touched women the way Silas touched you, the way that trapper wanted to touch you." He took a ragged breath, pacing to the fire and back. "I sit here, night after night, and I want to... God help me. Clara, I want to hold you. I want to feel you in my arms. And the wanting makes me sick, because I don't know. I don't know if it's me wanting you, or if it's just the man in me, the animal that wants to take..." He looked at her, his face a landscape of torment. "I'd die before becoming one of them. I'd die before I ever made you feel like property. I would rather light this cabin on fire with me in it than see that look in your eyes, the one you had at the trading post, the one that said you were dead inside. I won't be the man who puts that look there." Clara stared at him. The fear, the restraint, the distance. It wasn't about her. It wasn't rejection. It was his own penance. He was protecting her, not from the world, but from himself. A strange, fierce tenderness swelled in her chest, so powerful it almost brought tears to her eyes. He was a good man, terrified of the darkness he knew lived in all men. This knowledge changed everything. He had given her the power, and he didn't even know it. If he would not take, she would have to give. She began her campaign the next morning. It was a seduction of profound slowness, a quiet assault on his iron defenses. When she handed him his morning coffee, she didn't just let their fingers brush. She wrapped her hand over his, forcing him to take the cup from her grasp. She held his gaze as she did it, a small, defiant smile on her lips. He snatched his hand back as if burned, spilling hot coffee over the side. When they worked in the garden, she knelt close to him, so close their shoulders touched as they pulled weeds. He would go rigid, his breathing stopping, and then he would find a reason to move to the other end of the row. She took over the mending of his shirts. She would hold them up, ask him to stand still so she could measure, and let her hands linger on his chest, on his arms. She traced the line of his collarbone with her knuckle, pretending to check a seam, and watched his throat work as he swallowed. It was a delicious, terrible torment, and it was tormenting them both. The tension in the cabin grew thick and heavy as honey, charged with unspoken desire. He became jumpy, irritable. He chopped wood with a savage intensity, trying to exhaust the energy building in him. One night, she read from his journal, but she didn't sit across the room. She sat on the hearth, leaning back against his knees. He sat frozen in his chair, his entire body locked rigid. She could feel the tremors running through his legs. "Clara," he said, his voice strained. Don't what, Elias?" she murmured, tilting her head back to look up at him. "Don't sit near you. You know what you're doing." "Yes," she said. "I do. I'm waiting for you to see me. I'm not a ghost. I'm not a memory of your wife. And I'm not a bruised girl you have to save. I'm just Clara. And I am right here." She turned back to the book, and he did not move for the rest of the night. The breaking point came with the first thunderstorm of the season. It rolled in from the west, a bruised, black wall of clouds that swallowed the peaks. The air grew heavy, static, and then the sky tore open. Rain hammered the roof like a drum fire. Thunder exploded overhead, rattling the very logs of the cabin. Lightning flashed, bleaching the room in stark, white light, followed by immediate, echoing darkness. It was a violent, primal storm. Elias stood by the window, watching the trees bend and sway. He was restless, his shoulders tight. He was a caged animal. Clara had been banking the fire. She stood up, her heart hammering in time with the thunder. This was it. The world was at war, and the peace in their cabin was a lie. She walked up behind him. He didn't turn. He just watched the storm. "Elias," she said. He turned slowly. His face was stark in the flashes of lightning, his eyes dark, his scar a pale slash. She didn't give him time to speak, to build his walls. She stepped into his space, put her hands on his chest, and rose on her toes. She kissed him. It was not the soft, questioning kiss of weeks ago. It was a kiss of certainty, of desperation, of a woman who knew what she wanted. She poured all her newfound strength, all her gratitude, all her fear, and all her desire into it. She pressed her body against his, her hands sliding up to tangle in his long hair, pulling his face down to hers. He groaned, a sound of agony and surrender, his hands coming up to grip her waist. He meant to push her away, but his fingers dug into her, holding her fast. He kissed her back, a raw, desperate hunger breaking free. He backed her against the wall, his body pinning hers, his mouth devouring hers. He tore his lips away, breathing like he'd been running. "Clara, we can't. I can't." "Yes, you can," she whispered, her voice shaking but fierce. She pressed her forehead to his, her hands framing his face, forcing him to look at her. The cabin was lit again, a long, spidery crack of lightning. "I am not made of glass. I won't break," she said. "Please, Elias, I'm so tired of being afraid. Please, let me feel safe in your arms. Just once. Truly safe." She had reframed it. She hadn't asked for desire. She had asked for safety. And that, he knew how to give. That broke him. The last of his restraint shattered, with a sound that was half sob, half growl. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He carried her a few feet to the bed and laid her down on the furs. The thunderclaps covered the sounds of their breathing. He did not remove her clothes, or his. He lay down beside her, his heavy frame a comfort, and pulled her against him. He kissed her again, but this time it was slow, trembling. He kissed her forehead, her eyelids, her scarred cheek. "You are safe," he whispered against her skin. "You are safe." He undid the buttons of her dress with fumbling, clumsy fingers, his hands shaking. She helped him. This was not a taking. It was a discovery. He watched her face in the flashes of lightning, his eyes asking the question over and over. "Are you sure? Is this right?" And she answered, not with words, but by pulling him closer, by meeting his gaze, by touching his face, his scar, his shoulders. It was slow and raw and profoundly gentle. It was her first time that mattered, her first time chosen. And when he finally moved, when they finally joined, she cried out, not in pain, but in a profound, earth-shattering release. She was home. Later, the storm rumbled away into the distance, leaving only the steady drum of rain on the roof. Elias held her, his arms wrapped around her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she had never felt so free. He was asleep, his face buried in her hair, the deep peace he had been denied for so long finally claiming him. But as Clara lay there, listening to his steady breathing, a new and terrible fear crept into her heart. She had felt it, happiness, true, bone-deep happiness. It felt too good. It felt fragile. The world, her world, did not allow for such things. It was a world that took, that broke. This feeling of safety, this perfect, simple peace. It couldn't last. She held him tighter, suddenly terrified that the dawn would come and snatch it all away. The fear was a prophecy. 3 weeks later, the world was aggressively green. A man rode up to the cabin. He was old, grizzled, and leading a pack mule, a prospector named Jedediah, though he'd told them to call him Pete. He was grateful for a hot meal and a safe place to rest for the night. They sat by the fire, sharing tobacco and coffee. Pete was a talker, full of news from the settlements and the gold camps. "Was down at McTavish's post about a month back," Pete said, packing his pipe. "Strangest thing. Fella in there, mean-looking trapper. Name of Stone, Jebediah Stone." Clara's hand, which had been resting on Elias's knee, tightened. Elias went still. "This Stone," Pete continued, oblivious. "He was raising hell, telling everyone he'd been cheated. Said some wild mountain man stole his property, made him look weak in front of the whole post. He was drunk, but he was mean in it. Swore he was hiring a couple men and coming up here to get what was his. Said he was going to burn the man who shamed him right out of his own cabin." Pete lit his pipe, puffing smoke. "You folks best be watchful. This is the only cabin in this pass. If he's talking about a mountain man up here, he's talking about you, and he didn't look like a man who makes idle threats." The traveler left the next morning, leaving a cloud of dread hanging over the homestead. The peace was gone. Elias said nothing. He walked to the corner, took down his heavy rifle, and sat at the table. He began to meticulously disassemble it, cleaning each piece with an oiled rag. His movements were precise, economical, and cold. The man who wrote poetry was gone. The Union Scout had returned. He worked all day. He restrung the heavy bear traps, not on the game trails, but in the woods bordering the cabin, concealing them with branches. He checked his supply of powder and lead. Late in the afternoon, he turned to Clara. She was standing at the door, watching him, her stomach a cold knot. His face was hard, his eyes flat. "Pete's mule is still fresh. Mine are stronger. Take the gray mule. Pack 2 weeks of food. The South Trail, the one I showed you. It'll lead you to the next valley. There's a town there. You can find work. You'll be safe." He was cutting her loose. He was giving her an escape. He wouldn't chain her to this. Clara looked at him, at the rifle leaning against the wall, at the traps by the door. She looked at the bed where he had held her. This was her home. He was her home. She walked over to him, her heart pounding. She did not cry. "No," she said. He stopped his work, looking up at her. "Clara, this ain't a discussion. These men are coming to kill me. They will not be kind to you." I said no. Her voice was quiet, but it was steel. "You think I'm that girl you found? The one who would run? You taught me to shoot. You taught me to trap. You taught me to survive." She stepped closer, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You paid 4 barrels for me, Elias, a fortune, but I would walk barefoot through the snow to stay with you. This is my home. You are my home, and I will not let that man, or any man, take it from me." Elias stared at her, the mask of the cold soldier cracking. He saw the strength he had fostered, the fire he had rekindled. A terrible, fierce pride lit his eyes, mixed with a profound fear for her. He had offered her freedom, and she had chosen chains. She had chosen him. He was silent for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. He reached for a box on the shelf and tossed it onto the table. It landed with a heavy, metallic rattle. "Then you best learn to load this quickly," he said, "because they are coming." The homestead became a fortress. The quiet work of spring, of planting and mending, was replaced by the grim, urgent work of war. Elias moved with a cold, focused energy that Clara had not seen before. He was no longer the gentle man who carved owls. He was the scout who had survived Andersonville. He began by shuttering the single-glass window, barring it from the inside with 2 thick planks of oak, leaving only a narrow slit for light and for a rifle. He reinforced the heavy door, adding a new, thicker bar. He spent a full day on the roof, replacing dried-out shingles that might catch a spark, and checking the integrity of the stone chimney. Clara did not watch. She worked. "I need to shoot," she said on the first morning. Elias was cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time, his hands moving with automatic precision. He didn't look up. "No. Your job is to stay inside. Stay low. You are the one thing I cannot replace. You are the one thing I cannot let them touch." "And what if they get past you?" she insisted, stepping in front of him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "What if you are wounded? Am I to sit here and wait, like a prize for the winner?" "I will not. I am not a sack of flour. Elias, I am your partner. Teach me." He stared at her, his jaw tight. He saw the iron in her spine, the unshakable resolve. She was not asking, she was telling. He gave a single, curt nod. He took down his second rifle, a lighter caliber Spencer carbine he kept for deer. He spent an hour drilling her in the mechanics. How to load, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger, not pull it, how to account for the kick. "Don't fight the kick," he said, his voice flat and impersonal, like a drill sergeant. "It will break your shoulder. Become part of the gun. Let the force move through you." They went out behind the cabin, into the thick pines. He set up a row of tin cans on a fallen log 50 yards away. Her first shot was a disaster. She tensed. She flinched at the explosion, and the bullet went wide, striking a tree 10 feet to the left. The recoil slammed the stock into her shoulder, a brutal, jarring punch that made her cry out. "Again," he said, his voice hard. She rubbed her shoulder, tears of pain and frustration in her eyes. She reloaded, her fingers clumsy. She sighted, she breathed, she squeezed. She missed. Again. They were out there for hours. She fired until her shoulder was a mass of purple bruising, until her ears rang, until the smell of gunpowder was etched into her skin. He did not praise her. He did not comfort her. He just corrected her stance, her grip, her breathing. "You're thinking about the noise," he said, his voice rough. "Stop thinking. There is only the sight, the target, and your breath. Nothing else exists. Not them, not me, just the target." She loaded again. Her body ached. She was angry. Angry at him for his coldness. Angry at the men who were coming. Angry at the world that demanded this. She raised the rifle. She aligned the sight. She let out her breath. She squeezed. The sharp ping of the bullet striking metal echoed through the woods. The can jumped, spinning off the log. Clara lowered the rifle. her arms trembling. Elias finally looked at her. A flicker of something, pride, fear, passed through his eyes. "Good. Now do it again. 5 more times." In the stillness of the waiting, a strange thing happened. Their bond, forged in the quiet of winter, did not break under the strain. It annealed. The fear stripped away the last of their reservations, the last of their polite distances. There was no time for anything but the raw truth. They woke before dawn, their bodies tangled together, his arm a heavy, protective bar across her waist. They would lie in silence for a long time, listening to the morning birds, a sound of peace that felt like a lie. He would kiss her then, a slow, deep kiss that was both a greeting and a promise, a reassurance that they were both still there. They worked all day, a silent team, but the evenings were theirs. The poetry journal, which had been put away, came back out. She would read to him by the firelight, her voice a soft anchor in the growing dread. The words of loss and solitude now sounded different. They were no longer about what he had lost. They were about what he had found. They talked about the future, a thing that had once seemed impossible. They spoke of it in hushed, sacred tones, like a prayer. "After this," she said one night, tracing the lines on his palm, "I want to plant wildflowers in the garden, not just vegetables, something useless, something beautiful." Elias watched her, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "You'd like that? Flowers?" "I'd like that," she said. "Blue ones, the color of the mountain sky in summer. Bluebells. Then," he said, "we can find some by the creek. Transplant them." He was talking about the future. He was letting himself believe in one, but the past was a heavy debt, and it visited him in the dark. The nightmares, which had plagued Clara, now returned to him. He would wake with a choked cry, his hands reaching for a throat that wasn't there, his body slick with sweat. One night, she woke to find him sitting at the table, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The moon through the rifle slit illuminated him in a single, pale bar of light. She got up, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and sat across from him. "Tell me," she whispered. He was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, a ghost's voice. "It wasn't just the enemy," he said. "It was our own. We were cut off, near Chattanooga. A full week, no supplies. We were starving. I had a partner, a scout. Name was Daniel, young kid from Ohio, full of fire." He stopped, swallowing. "We drew lots. For the last of the hardtack. He won, but our corporal, a man named Shaw, he wanted it. He said Daniel was weak, that he wouldn't make it anyway, that a stronger man deserved it." Elias raised his head, and his eyes were haunted. "Shaw tried to take it from him in the night. I stopped him. I held a knife to his throat. I told him I'd kill him, and he looked at me, and he smiled. He knew I wouldn't. Not one of our own." He took a ragged breath. 2 days later, Shaw led a patrol. He told me to scout the left flank. He told Daniel to scout the right. It was a lie. There was no patrol. It was just him. He waited until I was gone, and he shot Daniel in the back. For a piece of bread. He said Daniel was hit by a rebel sharpshooter. I knew he was lying. I knew it. And I did nothing. I had no proof. I just had to live with it. I had to walk beside him for another month, knowing he was a murderer. He looked at his hands. I lost hope then. I lost faith in anything. God, man, the Union. It was all just noise. Just animals in a cage, waiting to eat each other. I came up here to get away from the animals, to forget I was one of them." Clara listened, her heart aching for the man he had been and the man he had become. The war had broken more than his body. It had broken his soul. She moved from her chair, kneeling beside him. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. Then, gently, she kissed his scar, the one that ran up his jaw. "You're wrong," she whispered against his skin. "You survived. You kept living. You held on when everything told you to let go. You didn't do it to forget. You did it to wait." He looked at her, confused. "You kept yourself alive for me. Elias," she said. her voice fierce with a certainty that shook them both. "You didn't know it, but I was coming. You had to stay alive, so you could be at that trading post. You had to become a man who could see me, a man who would pay 4 barrels. She kissed his other cheek. "Your past, all that horror, it wasn't a punishment. It was a map. It led you here. It led you to me." He stared at her, the haunted look in his eyes fading, replaced by a raw, profound awe. He had seen his survival as a curse. She had just reframed it as an act of providence. He pulled her onto his lap, burying his face in her neck, holding her as if she were the only thing keeping him from drifting away. He didn't speak. He just held her. The waiting ended 3 days later. It was just after dawn. Elias was already on watch, standing by the rifle slit. Clara was stoking the fire for coffee. "Clara," he said. His voice was perfectly calm, deadly calm. "Get Spencer. Go to the cot. Stay low. Do not make a sound." Her blood went cold. She did as he said, grabbing the rifle, her heart hammering. She crouched behind the thick log bed, her eyes fixed on his back. "How many?" she whispered. "3, he said. "On the ridge, in the trees. They're watching." They had come. The day was a symphony of tension. Nothing happened. The men on the ridge did not move. They were patient. They were testing Elias's defenses. They wanted to see his patterns. Did he come out for wood? Did he fetch water? Elias did not move from the window. He did not eat. He did not drink. He stood like a statue, his rifle resting on the sill, watching them watch him. Clara stayed behind the bed, every muscle aching, the rifle heavy in her lap. The sun crawled across the sky. The cabin grew hot. The silence was absolute, broken only by the buzz of a fly. As dusk began to fall, the shadows in the trees moved. The men were gone. "They're not leaving," Elias said, his voice low. "They're just moving. They'll wait until dark." He looked at Clara. "Stay here. Bar the door behind me. Do not open it until you hear me knock. 3 short, 1 long. Understood?" "Elias, no. Where are you going?" she pleaded, rising. "I was a scout. Clara, I hunt in the dark. They're comfortable right now. They think they have me in a box. I'm going to make them uncomfortable. I need to know the plan." He moved to the door. "Bar it." She did, her hands shaking. She watched him slip out, a shadow melting into other shadows. He was gone. Clara was alone in the cabin. The darkness had never felt so complete. She sat with her back to the door, the Spencer carbine across her knees, and she listened. Every creak of the logs, every skitter of a mouse, every sigh of the wind was an enemy. Hours passed. 1, 2. She was drifting into a state of terrified exhaustion when she heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Tap! She flew to the door, fumbling with the heavy bar. She tore it open. Elias slipped inside. He was pale, shaken, his breathing ragged. He leaned against the wall, and she saw he was trembling. The man who never showed fear was terrified. "Elias, what is it? What did you hear?" He looked at her, his eyes wild. "They're not just coming for me, they're coming for you." He had circled them, moving through the woods with a silence he had learned in the war. He had found their camp, a small, cold fire hidden in a draw a 1/4 mile away. He had lain in the darkness, 20 feet away, and he had listened. He had heard Jeb Stone's voice, rough and full of hate. "We wait till just before dawn." Stone had said, "Put a torch to the roof. When he comes out, we shoot him. Simple as that." "What about the girl?" one of the others had asked. A reedy voice. Clara watched Elias's face twist in disgust as he relayed the words. Stone laughed, Elias whispered. He said, "The girl is the payment. She's worth 4 barrels of flour. We'll find out if he was right. After I'm done, you can have her. We'll sell her at the next camp." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Elias grabbed her shoulders, his grip desperate. "Clara, you have to go, now. While it's dark, take the mule, take the south trail. I will hold them here. I will slow them down. I will give you a day's head start." "No," she said, her voice shaking. I won't leave you. You will, he roared, his voice cracking. He shook her. Do you understand what they will do to you? I will die 1,000 times before I let them put their hands on you. I am begging you, Clara. If you have ever felt anything for me, if this life has meant anything, please, let me save you. Go, go! She looked at him, at the raw terror in his eyes. It was not for himself. It was all for her. She shook her head. No, Elias, you taught me to shoot. You taught me to be strong. Did you think I would use that strength to run? She put her hand on his chest, over his heart. We live here, or we die here, but we do it together. He stared at her, seeing the futility of his plea. She was as stubborn as the mountains. She would not break. She would not run. A terrible, shuddering sigh tore through him. He had lost. He pulled her to him, crushing her in an embrace. He wasn't holding her. He was holding on. God forgive me, he whispered. God forgive me. There were no more words. The time for planning was over. The time for running was done. There was only the night and the coming dawn. He led her to the bed. He didn't ask. He just pulled her down onto the furs. This was not the gentle, exploratory lovemaking of the spring. This was a desperate, fierce, almost violent claim. It was a goodbye. It was a protest against the dawn. They made love with a raw intensity, their bodies slick with sweat, the sound of their breathing filling the dark cabin. It was a drowning, a fire, a last, desperate attempt to feel alive before the end. He kissed her with a hunger that tasted of fear, and she met him with a fierceness that tasted of devotion. They were memorizing each other, a last testament. Afterward, they lay tangled, their limbs heavy, their hearts pounding in unison. The cabin was silent. The moon was gone. The darkest hour was upon them. Clara lay with her head on his chest, listening to the slow, heavy beat of his heart. She knew, with a cold certainty, that one of them might not see the next sunset. Elias, she whispered into the darkness, I'm here. If I die tomorrow, if I die, I want your name on my lips. It will be the last word I say. I want them to know. He tightened his arm around her, his throat too thick to speak. He kissed the top of her head. He could not promise her survival. He could only promise to be with her. They lay in silence, and they waited for the fire. The black of the pre-dawn sky was just beginning to soften, turning a bruised, watery gray. This was the hour of ghosts, the coldest, quietest moment of the night, when the world held its breath before the sun. Inside the cabin, neither Elias nor Clara had slept. They were dressed, armed, and waiting. Elias stood by the rifle slit, his heavy buffalo rifle in his hands. Clara was crouched behind the bed, the Spencer carbine resting on the furs, her knuckles white. The air was thick, metallic with dread. It's time, Elias said. His voice was not a whisper. It was a flat, calm statement of fact. A flicker of movement at the tree line. Then another, a torch, held low, arced through the air. It landed on the roof with a soft thud. Stay down, Elias commanded. He was not watching the roof. He was watching the trees. The torch was a distraction. He knew they expected him to come out the front door, frantic, to fight the fire. Another torch flared, this one landing near the small lean-to where the mules were. A dry, hungry whoosh as the hay caught fire. That's the one, Elias murmured. He moved to the cabin door, unbarring it. Elias, no, Clara breathed, her terror rising. They've split up. Stone won't light the fire himself. He sent one man for the roof, one for the mules, to draw me out. Stone is waiting by the front. The man at the lean-to is the one I want. He's exposed. He slipped out the door. Not a man, but a shadow, melting into the gray darkness. Clara scrambled to the rifle slit. Peering out, she could see the lean-to beginning to burn, the flames casting a sick, orange light. The trapped mules screamed, a high, terrified sound that tore at her heart. A man, silhouetted against the new fire, was throwing more tinder onto the flames. He laughed, a reedy, thin sound. It was the man Elias had called Finch, but Elias was not moving toward Finch. He had disappeared in the opposite direction, toward the dark, silent woods. He had seen something Clara had not. Suddenly, a new fire erupted, 20 yards into the forest, a wall of flame that shot up the side of a pine tree. A man shrieked. It was not Finch. It was the third man, Cole. Elias had soaked the brush with kerosene days before. A fire trap. "He's running," she heard Finch yell, panicked. "Cole, he's in the trees." Clara watched, her heart in her throat, as Finch abandoned the lean-to and ran toward the new fire, his rifle raised. Then she saw Elias. He was not in the trees. He was a low shadow, circling behind Finch, using the distraction of the two fires. But there was another man, Jebediah Stone. The trapper exploded from the side of the cabin, where he had been hiding. A massive, dark shape. He had seen Elias. He bellowed, a wordless roar of rage, and charged, not with a rifle, but with a long, glittering skinning knife in his hand. Elias was caught. He was halfway between the cabin and the woods. His rifle still pointed toward the trees where he had intended to ambush Finch. He spun, bringing his rifle up like a club, just in time to block the trapper's first, wild swing. The force of the collision was brutal. Wood cracked against bone. Stone's knife skittered off the rifle barrel, and Elias slammed the butt of the gun into the trapper's face. It was not a fight. It was a butcher. The two men fell to the ground, rolling in the thin, patchy snow, two giant animals tearing at each other. Stone was a brawler, fueled by rage. He drove the knife again and again, trying to get past Elias's defenses. Elias the scout was quicker. He deflected. He punched. He moved. Clara watched, horrified. Through the slit, she couldn't shoot. They were too close, a tangled mass of limbs and fury. Finch, the third man, heard the fight. He stopped, confused, turning back from the fire trap. He saw his partner locked in combat. He raised his rifle. Clara saw him. He was taking aim at the struggling figures on the ground. At Elias. "No," she whispered. All the training, all the hours of pain, all of Elias's cold commands, crystallized into one single moment. She jammed the Spencer through the rifle slit. She didn't have time to think. She found the sight. She found the target, the dark shape of Finch's chest. She let out her breath. She squeezed. The explosion was deafening inside the cabin. The rifle slammed into her already bruised shoulder, a white-hot spike of agony. She screamed, but the sound was lost in the gunshot. Outside, Finch stood bolt upright, a look of profound surprise on his face. He made a small, wet, coughing sound. He looked down at his chest, then dropped his rifle, and fell face first into the snow. He did not move again. She had done it. She had killed a man. The sound of the shot, so close, momentarily distracted the two fighters. Stone used it. As Elias's head turned for a split second toward the cabin, Stone surged. He drove his knife deep into Elias's side, just under the ribs. Elias roared, a deep, agonized sound. The fight broke. He staggered back, clutching his side, his rifle falling to the ground. Blood, black in the dawn light, poured between his fingers. Stone laughed, a triumphant, ugly sound. He got to his feet, breathing hard, his face a mask of blood from where Elias had hit him. "You're done, mountain man!" he spat. Elias was on one knee, swaying. He had his own knife out, but he was weakening fast, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. Stone saw Clara, her white face a small oval in the rifle slit. "And now for my property," he snarled. He ignored the wounded Elias, believing him finished. He charged the cabin door. Clara fumbled with Spencer, trying to reload, but her hands were shaking too hard. The mechanism jammed. The door burst open, splintering off its hinges. Jeb Stone filled the doorway, his eyes wild, his bloody knife in his hand. "Come here, girl," he growled. "You've been a heap of trouble." Clara scrambled backward, away from the bed, holding the useless rifle like a shield. "No!" she screamed. "Get away from me!" He lunged, grabbing her by the hair. He yanked her hard, pulling her off her feet. She screamed again as he dragged her out of the cabin, out into the cold, smoky air. He threw her to the ground, near the body of the man she had just shot. "You're mine," he panted, wiping his bloody mouth. "You were always mine. That fool just kept you warm for me." He loomed over her. Elias was still on the ground, 10 yards away, trying to push himself up, but his arm kept collapsing. He was dying. "Elias!" Clara screamed. Stone laughed and reached down for her. Clara's terror turned to a pure, primal rage. She was not a girl. She was not a victim. She was not property. As Stone's hand clamped onto her arm, she fought back like a cornered wolverine. She drove her fingernails into his face, raking them down his cheeks. He howled in pain, recoiling, and she scrambled away, crab-walking backward in the snow. "You little bitch!" he roared, swiping at the blood. He came at her again. She grabbed the first thing her hand found in the snow, a heavy, jagged rock, half buried in the mud. He lunged for her. She swung the rock with all the strength in her arms and slammed it into the side of his head. There was a sickening, wet crack. Stone stopped. His eyes widened, his jaw going slack. He staggered, putting a hand to his temple, where blood now matted his hair. He looked at his fingers, confused. He had underestimated her. He turned back, his face a mask of pure hate, and raised his knife to kill her. "I'll gut you," he whispered. A single gunshot. It was louder than hers, deeper, an explosion that echoed off the mountains. Jeb Stone froze. The knife slipped from his fingers. He stood for a long second, his body rigid. He tried to speak. A bubble of blood formed on his lips. Then he pitched forward, collapsing in the snow, his dead eyes staring at the cabin he had tried to burn. Clara was splattered with his blood. She sat, paralyzed, the rock still in her hand. "Elias," she whispered. She looked over. He was lying on his side, his heavy buffalo rifle still smoking, propped on his shaking arm. He had used the last of his strength to make the shot. As she watched, his arm gave out. He collapsed onto his back, his face white, his eyes closing. The chaos of the attack vanished, replaced by a terrible, ringing silence. There was only the sound of the burning lean-to, the high, frantic screaming of the mules, and Clara's own ragged breathing. She was alive. The men were dead, and Elias was dying. "No," she said. "No, no, no." She scrambled to her feet, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. She ran to him, falling to her knees in the bloody snow beside him. "Elias, Elias, look at me. Stay awake." He was pale as the snow, his breathing shallow and wet. The wound in his side was a dark, pulsing well. He was fading. He was leaving her. "No!" she screamed, her voice breaking. You cannot leave me. I will not let you." The panic was so vast it threatened to swallow her. But then, the cold, hard voice of her teacher cut through it. "Don't fight the kick. Become part of it. Stop thinking. There is only the target. He was the target. Survival was the target." "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Okay, we're going to fix this. You taught me. Taught." He was a dead weight, a huge, impossible man. She grabbed him under the arms. "You have to help me. Elias, help me." He didn't respond. She pulled. She dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, back across the snow, leaving a thick, crimson trail. She hauled him over the broken threshold, into the cabin, away from the dead eyes of the men who had tried to kill them. She dragged him to the bed, but she couldn't lift him. She laid him on the bearskin rug near the fire, his head propped on a pillow. She ran to the door, slammed the broken pieces shut, and dropped the bar. She was safe. For now. She turned back to him. He was barely breathing. She ripped his shirt open. The knife wound was deep, a gaping, dark slash in his side. It was bleeding too fast. "Pressure," she said aloud, her voice shaking. She grabbed a clean flannel shirt, one of his, and pressed it hard into the wound. He didn't flinch. She pressed harder, using all her weight. She worked. She was no longer Clara. She was an extension of his will, a vessel for the skills he had drilled into her. She stoked the fire until it was roaring. Heating a kettle of water, she found his sutures, the ones he used for mending deep cuts in the mules. She found his jug of whiskey. She washed the wound, her hands surprisingly steady. He had taught her to skin a rabbit, to clean a deer. This was just meat. She had to believe that. She threaded the needle. Her hands started to shake. "I can't, Elias, I can't." She looked at his face, the scar on his jaw, the man who wrote poetry, the man who had paid 4 barrels. "Yes, I can," she whispered. She poured the whiskey over the wound. He spasmed, a low groan rising in his chest. His first sound. She flinched, tears springing to her eyes, but she didn't stop. She took the needle, and she made the first stitch. For 2 days, he drifted in a sea of fever. He was not in the cabin. He was somewhere else, somewhere dark. He was back in the war, shouting at a man named Shaw, begging someone named Sarah to run. He thrashed, his strong body fighting phantoms, reopening the wound. Clara had to use strips of leather to tie his wrists to the table legs, to keep him from killing himself. She did not sleep. She sat by his side, a sentinel. She spooned broth and water between his cracked lips. She kept the wound clean. She kept the fire high. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. He stopped fighting. He just lay still, too still. His breathing was so shallow she had to put her ear to his lips to feel it. He was slipping. "No," she said, her voice raw from days of talking. She grabbed his hand. It was cold. "Elias, you listen to me. You do not get to do this. You do not get to save me and then leave me. I will not be alone again. Do you hear me? I will not." She was crying, the tears dripping onto his hand. "You kept yourself alive for me. You told me. You said you were a scout. You said you survived. Well, survive this. You are not allowed to die. I forbid it." She talked for hours. She told him about the garden they would plant. She read his poetry to him, her voice breaking. She sang the one hymn her mother had taught her, over and over, until her throat was sore. She kissed his hand, his forehead, his scarred jaw. "I love you," she whispered, the words finally spoken into the void. "So you have to come back. You have to—" She must have fallen asleep, her head on his chest, exhausted, defeated. She woke to the sound of a voice, a rough, cracked whisper. "Worth, more." Clara's head snapped up. Elias's eyes were open, just slits, but he was looking at her. He was seeing her. A small, painful smile curled his lips. He was alive. "Told you," he whispered, his voice a bare rasp. "Told you you're worth more than 4 barrels. Summer bled into a hazy, golden autumn. The mountainside, which had been a uniform green, exploded into a riot of yellow and rust as the aspens turned. The air grew crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine and the promise of coming snow. Months passed. The physical scars on the land healed. The lean-to was rebuilt, stronger this time. The patch of earth where Jeb Stone had fallen was now covered in wild grass. Clara had buried the 3 men herself, dragging them one by one to a deep ravine a mile from the cabin, while Elias lay in his fever dream, shouting at ghosts. She had not felt a thing as she did it. It was just another chore. Elias recovered, but he did not recover completely. The trapper's knife had gone deep, severing muscle and sinew in his side. He healed, but his body was no longer the perfectly balanced instrument it had been. He walked with a permanent, pronounced limp, his right leg dragging slightly. The raw, untamed power he once possessed was now tempered by a visible vulnerability. He could no longer move like a shadow. He could no longer haul the massive logs he once had. As he diminished, Clara grew. The homestead was hers now, in a way it had never been. She ran it, while Elias healed, sitting by the fire and carving, his hands restless. Clara took the rifles and went into the woods. She hunted, and she brought back meat. She reset the trap lines. She finished the garden, her hands becoming calloused and strong. She chopped the wood, her shoulders broadening. the rhythm of the axe becoming as familiar to her as breathing. She was in charge. A quiet, confident strength flowed from her. She had been tested by fire, and she had not burned. Elias watched her, a complex mix of pride and a new, quiet humility in his eyes. He had been her protector, her teacher. Now, in many ways, she was his. She helped him when he rose, her hand steady on his arm. She dressed the wound in his side long after it had closed, her touch gentle on the puckered, red scar. He no longer slept on the edge of the bed, a guardian. He slept pressed against her, seeking her warmth, her strength. They were no longer a savior and a survivor. They were just a man and a woman, leaning on each other. "We need salt," she said one morning in late September, looking at their dwindling supplies. "And flour, and coffee. The 4 barrels are almost gone." Elias nodded, his face grim. "McTavish's," the name hung in the air. Neither of them had left the mountains since the attack. The thought of the settlement, of the people, of the place where she had been sold, was a cold knot in Clara's stomach. "We go together," Elias said. It was not a question. The journey down was slow. Elias could no longer ride for long periods, the jolting of the mule agony on his side. He walked much of the way, his limp more pronounced on the uneven trail. Clara walked beside him, her Spencer rifle resting comfortably in the crook of her arm. When they emerged from the trees into the valley, the settlement looked small, dirty, and loud. She had forgotten how many people there were. They tethered the mules outside McTavish's. The moment they stepped onto the porch, the talking stopped. The trading post, which had been bustling with trappers and townsfolk, went utterly silent. Every eye turned to them, to Elias, the mountain man who was rumored to have killed 3 men in a single morning. And to Clara, they stared at her. They stared at the rifle she carried, at the buckskin trousers she wore, which Elias had cut down for her. They stared at the way she moved, not a shuffling, frightened girl, but a woman who walked with her head high, her eyes clear and level. The whispers began. The men looked at her with a new, startled respect, mixed with a crude awe. She was the one who had made the shot. She was the one who had killed Finch. She was a legend, a white-faced girl who had fought like a savage. The women, gathered by the bolts of cloth, were different. Their eyes were cold, filled with scorn. They saw a woman living in sin, a woman who had shacked up with a wild man in the mountains. Unmarried, unchurched, they saw a fallen woman. Clara felt the heat of their stares, the judgment. For a moment, the old fear returned. She faltered, her hand moving to her throat. Then, she felt Elias's hand, calloused and warm, settle on the small of her back. He leaned on her, just slightly, a public declaration. He stood beside her, his scarred face daring any of them to speak a word. Clara took a breath. She looked at the scornful women, at the awestruck men, and she felt nothing. Their opinions were the wind. They had not been there. They had not stitched a man's life back together. They had not fought for their home. She walked past them, her boots loud on the floorboards, and went to the counter. "We need flour, Mr. McTavish," she said, her voice clear and strong. "And salt, and 20 pounds of coffee beans." McTavish, his eyes wide, scrambled to serve her. While she was gathering the supplies, he turned to Elias. "A letter came for you, weeks ago, from the East, a lawyer." He handed Elias a crumpled, wax-sealed envelope. Elias looked at it, confused. He hadn't received a letter in more than 10 years. They did not wait to open it. They packed their supplies and left the whispers of the town behind them, climbing back toward the silence of the peaks. That night, by the fire, Elias broke the seal. His reading was slow, his finger tracing the lines of unfamiliar legal script. Clara watched his face, his expression turning from confusion to disbelief, and then to a strange, hollow shock. "Elias, what is it? Is it bad news?" He was silent for a long time, the letter trembling in his hand. "My father," he said, his voice distant. "He died 2 years ago. I didn't even know." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "He was a hard man," Elias said, staring at the paper. We didn't part well, but he left me land. He owned property, back in Ohio, timberland. The lawyer finally tracked me down. He sold it. It's been sitting in a bank. It's a lot of money. Clara, a small fortune. He looked around the cabin, at the smoke-stained walls, the floor she had scrubbed clean of his blood, the broken door he had mended. He looked at his hands, scarred and calloused. He was, by the world standards, a wealthy man. He looked at her, his eyes full of a new, uncertain weight. We could leave, he said, the words coming out slow. We could go anywhere, California, Oregon. I could build you a real house, a big one, with glass windows, not just a slit in the wall. You could have dresses. You wouldn't have to hunt. You wouldn't have to chop wood. He was offering her the world. He was offering her the life she might have had, a life of comfort, of safety. Clara looked at him. She saw the hope in his eyes, and the fear. He was afraid she would say yes, afraid she would want the dresses, the glass windows, the life he thought she deserved. She smiled, a slow, sure smile. She reached across the small space and put her hand on his knee. Elias, she said softly, what would I do with a big house? This cabin? This is the first home I have ever had. This land is the first place that ever felt like mine. She leaned forward, her eyes holding his. You gave me a kingdom with 4 barrels of flour. You gave me this mountain. You gave me this sky. And you gave me you. There isn't enough money in all of Ohio to buy me anything better than that. He let out the breath he had been holding. He reached out and touched her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. Clara, he whispered, his voice thick. But, she said, her smile turning mischievous, I might take you up on that glass window. He laughed, a true, deep laugh that made the cabin feel warmer. The letter changed one thing. It made them realize their bond, forged in blood and survival, was theirs. It belonged to no one else, but it deserved to be named. They married 3 days later at the height of the autumn color. There was no preacher. There was no church. They walked to a high grove of aspen trees, their leaves a shimmering, golden canopy. The mountains were their witness, the wind their only hymn. They stood facing each other, his hand in hers. I have nothing to give you, Elias said, his voice rough with emotion. Nothing but what we've built. This life, my heart, it's all yours. Clara, it has been from the moment I saw you. You gave me my life, she said, her own voice trembling. You gave me myself. I am yours. Elias, not because you bought me, but because I choose you. I will always choose you. He didn't have a ring, not one of gold. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, circular piece of carved pine. He had spent the last 2 days working on it, his knife moving with a lover's care. It was sanded smooth as silk, the grain of the wood warm, and etched into the inside. In his jagged, careful script was her name, Clara. He slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate passion. It was a kiss of profound peace, a promise, a beginning. That night, they celebrated. Elias had traded a prime pelt for a bottle of wine at McTavish's. They drank it from the tin cups, the taste rich and sweet. They ate a feast of roast venison and the last of the garden carrots. They made love, not with the desperation of their last night, but with the slow, familiar passion of a husband and a wife. It was a reaffirmation. It was a celebration of every scar, every fear, every moment that had led them to this bed, to this quiet, simple joy. It was a love that was as solid and real as the mountains around them. The next day, Clara sat at the table while Elias was outside, his axe ringing in the crisp air. He was splitting wood, his limp pronounced, but his rhythm steady. She pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. She dipped it in the ink. She was writing a letter, one she would never send. She was writing to her mother. Mother, I don't know if you can see me. I don't know if you're at peace. I hope you are. I want you to know that I am. You must have worried. You must have known what Silas was. I want you to know that he's gone. that life is over. I was traded away, for flour, like I was nothing. I thought I was nothing. I was so tired. Mother, so ready to be done. But I was chosen. A man saw me. He saw the bruises, and he saw me behind them. He paid a fortune for me, and he asked for nothing in return. He gave me a home. He taught me to be strong. He gave me a rifle and showed me how to use it. He gave me his name. I am not the girl you knew. I am hard. I have been killed. I have seen death, but I have also seen what life can be. I am not afraid anymore. I was traded away, but I was chosen. And now, I choose. I choose this life. I chose this mountain. I chose him. I am safe. Mother, finally, I am safe. Your daughter, Clara. She folded the paper and put it in the poetry journal. She would keep it forever. The first snow of the new winter came a week later. It was not a blizzard. It was a gentle, quiet fall of thick, white flakes. Clara and Elias stood on the porch of their cabin, mugs of hot coffee in their hands. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the new snow in shades of soft pink and brilliant gold. The world was clean, pure, and utterly silent. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. He was solid. He was her anchor. He leaned back, his arms sliding around her waist, drawing strength from her. He looked out at the mountains, at the vast, beautiful, and dangerous world that had almost killed them, and had, in the end, saved them both. "You're not just my treasure, Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet morning. "You're not just my wife. You're my salvation. You walked into that cabin, and you brought my soul back to me." Clara turned her head, kissing the rough wool of his shirt. She looked up at his face, at the scar she now loved, at the eyes that had seen so much horror, and now only saw her. "And you," she whispered. "You're the first man who ever saw me." They stood in silence, watching the sun crest the peaks, warming the new, clean world. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I truly hope the journey of Clara and Elias resonated with you. I would be honored if you'd take a moment to comment and let me know where in the world you are listening from. Please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories like this. And I would love to read your thoughts on this tale. Please share them in English.